So, I bought a guitar from Gear for Music, but when I opened the box, it was in bits. Turns out that was a deliberate move on my part because I fancied the idea of building my own bass. It's called an LA Electric Bass Guitar DIY kit, intermediate level apparently. It's based off of a Fender Precision bass with its body and pickup setup, but costs a penny short of £100. But how much bass do you actually get for that amount? Well, that's part of what this video is about, as I'll be comparing it against an actual Fender Precision bass, like this one. But first, and this is what this video is mostly about, I need to build my bass. The very first thing I did was shape the headstock because in its raw form it looked like a floorboard, or a really blunt axe. I must admit, this plus the sanding were my least favourite part of the build. The tools I had available were rather rudimentary and nothing like the high-tech smorgasbord you see on more professional YouTube channels. Also, one of the planers broke. I did overcut the headstock slightly with the saw, but it wasn't a major issue in the end as I got to know the rasp and different types of sandpaper pretty well. Once the body and headstock was smooth enough, it was time to work on the actual design. I'm in a band called Ghostwriters, and I recently bought the drummer, who is my older brother Danny, a cap with a Ghostwriters embroidery. That was what I wanted on the headstock, although on one line rather than two. For this, I decided to create a stencil of around 15 centimeters long, which was then sellotaped onto the headstock and then filled in with a permanent marker. Creating the stencil was probably my second least favourite part of the build, mostly because of the letter R. It wasn't a very good permanent marker either, but I did have another one with a finer nib to fill in the edges, which was very useful. For the colour scheme, I went for a light blue cyan colour for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the background colour of the Ghostwriters logo on the Facebook page is within the same colour palette as cyan, and secondly, I have a bit of a silly idea where if this goes to plan, I'll build 3 more of these bases and paint them red, pink and orange. Why? Well, I'm a bit of a nerd and I quite like the idea of having 4 bases named after the Pac-Man ghosts. As a result, this guitar will be called Inky. If that plan does come to fruition, I would like to distinguish these 4 bases with something other than just the colour. My girlfriend has a pyrography kit which her dad has been using to create patterns on some homemade canes, and I've borrowed this to carve some lyrics onto the front of the body. For this one, I went for the opening line to the chorus of High Life, probably the most memorable part of our debut EP. While I was at it, I carved a big ghost onto the back, eyes and all. I enjoyed the pyrography a lot as I found it therapeutic to constructively burn things, and I was really pleased with the result. After the pyro came the glorious task of painting the body. To distinguish the ghost from the rest of the body, I found a tin of white gloss paint lurking around in the back of the garage and put a couple of coats of that on, but not before I applied the necessary amount of masking tape. I remember my hands feeling completely frozen during the first coat. That wasn't nice. Once the white had pretty much fully dried, on went just 1 coat of Sandtex Gentle Blue exterior satin paint. In hindsight, a 750ml tin was far too much for what I actually needed. Oh well, I'll probably use it for some furniture in the future. This was probably my second favourite part of the build, particularly when it got to painting around the pyro. One small issue was that some of the white paint had clotted a bit and ran slightly into the burn marks, so I patched these up with some more permanent marker. After all the paint had pretty much fully dried, I applied 2 or 3 coats of clear lacquer to the body to give it a smoother finish. Lacquer is pretty noxious stuff and I had to leave the garage rather quickly to keep my lungs as clear as possible. During this process, I had been watching a video where someone made a guitar out of concrete, and at some point he stained the neck and headstock with some oil which provided a nicer finish. Lurking in the back of the garage was some linseed oil that was even older than me, but it seemed to do the trick on my neck and headstock, even if it smelled terrible. Some of the permanent marker on the headstock ran slightly after the oil was applied, but only very slightly. The last major step was to assemble the bass with loads of screws and all the other typicalities that Gear for Music provided within the pack. Good job I had plenty of screwdrivers. I started off with the easiest part of the assembly, the strap buttons. Job done. Next was the pick guard and the electronic stuff, which was a bit of a pain, particularly after some of the wires wouldn't behave themselves. Additionally, a modification to the grounding wire was made to ensure that it definitely would ground by removing some of the insulation. The headstock was next, and this was more of an arsehole than I was expecting. 4 bits of cylindrical metal needed to go into the holes, but they were so snug that they had to be bashed in with a bit of wood and a hammer. The rest of it was pretty simple, although the tuning pegs do feel a little bit stiff. I then had to do a bit of surgery to connect the body and the neck, and this was actually quite easy. Next was to put on some strings, which Gear for Music very kindly included in the pack. I actually enjoy putting new strings on guitars as I find it satisfying, but it felt more so on this particular guitar as it was one I've assembled myself. Amazing, doesn't even need tuning. Oh, and I had to put a string guider on the headstock, which annoyed me because it covers up part of the logo. The penultimate thing to do was the setup, which included tightening the truss rod, moving the saddles away from the neck as all 12 frets were sharper than their harmonics, and lowering the saddles to suit my preferences. With the bass now set up, there was just one last thing to do: rock out with my Compared to my Fender, which is called Crash, the first thing I noticed was that the power output of Inky is quite low, but this won't be too much of a problem as I'll be purchasing a compressor pedal at some point in the near future. A Warwick I recently purchased has a similar trait. Secondly, I like the sound that Inky produces. It has that familiar precision mid-range sound which I like very much, and thirdly, Inky is a very light guitar which will be very useful for gigging, once we're allowed to do that again. I will mostly use this guitar for live performances and potentially music videos for Ghostwriters, whereas Crash tends to be my go-to standard E drop D studio bass. Overall, I really enjoyed the experience of making my own guitar despite some awkward moments, mostly with the headstock, and I definitely want to do this again at some point in the near future and add to the Ghostwriters Pac-Man collection, and for a penny short of £100, I say it's definitely worth it.